Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Following on from a popular request on the Patreon area of the Discord, today I'll be painting a new Seraphon Saurus warrior in the Starborne scheme, based on these fantastic box art versions. I don't have any recipes for this scheme, so I'll be completely starting from scratch here, and in this video I'll show a bit of my thinking and process for working out an approximate recipe using the images alone. This will be a two-part video, so in this first part I'll be painting the skin, scales and glow effect, and in the following part I'll cover the metallics, the weapon, the ropes, and all the smaller details on the miniature. I was also thinking of perhaps a little jungle themed base for him to go on, so let me know in the comments if that's something you would be interested in. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So to start off with here, I prepped and then I primed the miniature using Vallejo Black Primer. You can use any black primer for this, Chaos Black will do perfectly fine. I often get asked about gluing the miniature once the parts have been primed, so you might be able to see here that I've masked the joints on the arms using blue tack. I'll remove this when I come to glue the parts together, and this just helps to ensure a stronger bond with the glue. And you don't have to do this obviously, I find plastic glue will actually melt through small amounts of paint, no problem. But if you have had issues with parts not bonding, then this method might be useful for you. I'm going to be using an airbrush for the initial stages today, as you can see starting off by base coating using the Fang. Now I should mention here that I have absolutely no prior knowledge of the paints used in this recipe, but I'm going to outline a way that we can hopefully get somewhat close to the paints used, or at least a very similar outcome to the box art. Here I'm using a color picker in Adobe Photoshop to select colors from the base color, the shadows, the midtones and the highlights. And it's from this selection that I'll make an educated guess on the colors used. Now obviously this isn't always 100% accurate. The screen calibration as well as how saturated and exposed the original picture are will all make a difference. But it is a very valuable tool to help narrow down the paints used. And we can also further narrow this down with the knowledge that this is painted by the studio. So these are most likely Citadel paints, and there's only so many blue Citadel paints, unless of course it's some convoluted mix, which does make it a bit more tricky, but we can still use it to get a rough idea. Now it's very important that you compare these colours to the actual pot colours, so pick your pot of paint that you think it could be. In this case I think the Fang is going to be the closest match for the base coat, and then compare this to the screen colour. Don't try to match from the swatches on the website, as these are not very accurate in my experience. Now this is a very rare occasion that you'll see me using an airbrush to get the initial transitions, and this is just due to Pallid Witch Flesh being an absolute nightmare to work with. I think this is definitely my least favourite paint out of the whole Citadel range, however it does happen to have the exact same tone that I needed for the chest. I would highly suggest matching Pallid Witch with a mix of AK White and Rakarth Flesh. Again, Rakarth isn't the greatest paint either, but with the AK White added it should be a lot easier to work with than the Pallid Witch. Now personally, I'm not really a big fan of the airbrush finish, so I'll tend to glaze over these transitions later on by brush. However, if you are painting for an army, then it's not really going to matter too much if you leave some of this showing. And whether or not you do the following glazing stage is completely up to you and the time that you want to spend. Now to tidy up these stages. I made a roughly 1-to-1 mix of Pallid Witch and the Fang, and I'm going to use this to smooth out the spottiness from the airbrush and also to shade the skin. But first I quickly just went round and tidied up any overspray on the blue with a fresh coat of the Fang. With that done, I can now start to use the previous mix to soften the transitions on the outside of the belly and the chest, as well as using it as a soft shade around the recesses of the muscles. It's important to be quite subtle with this shading, as it's really easy to overdo it on lighter areas of skin like this, and I can end up with quite an unnatural and segmented look to the individual muscles, which is not really what I'm going for. And this is a glaze consistency paint, so I'm applying this over several thin layers. Once that was done, it was time to block in all the darker scaled areas on the back and the head of the Saurus. I decided I wanted a nice dark blue for this, so I mixed 1:1 Cantor blue and AK black. It was very difficult to work out from the box art pictures if it was in fact black, or very dark blue, or even purple. And I think really any of these would work just fine. It only really matters that it's very dark for the glow effect to work properly, and to give it that celestial look. And this is applied over a couple of coats, building up to an opaque layer. Once that was done, I thinned down this mix a bit further, adding a touch more Cantor into it, and then washed this into the recesses of the skin and anywhere where the skin blends into the scales. I did decide to add a touch of glaze medium into this, just to help it settle more evenly into the recesses, and I'm not too worried about it being a bit messy here and there, as I'll go back in with the base coat and tidy this afterwards. Once that was done, I went back in with the Fang base coat and just relayering this and tidying up the previous shading stage. Now for the highlight stage on the skin, I actually made a 1:1 mix between Fenrisian Grey and the Fang, but this is basically just rust grey, and I ended up switching to this later on for the highlights, as it's nice just to have the pre-mixed colour, and it helps to keep everything a bit more consistent. You'll tend to find lots of little tweaks and efficiencies to the recipe when you're painting a scheme for the first time, and that's a great reason to paint a test model like this first before painting a unit or an army. When I apply the first few stage highlights on organic areas like skin, I try to blend them in a bit more with the base coat, as personally I like softer transitions on these areas as opposed to the hard edges of armour. So I thin the paint a bit more for this than I would a normal chunky edge highlight, and then build this up over a few layers. For the final highlight stage on the skin, I used pure Fenrisian Grey and applied this towards the uppermost raised edges of the skin. You can go on to add white into this if you want to add any further corner highlights, but I would avoid going all the way up to pure white on its own. Now at this point you might have noticed that I've avoided painting in any of the highlights on the darker scaled areas, as I intend to add some glow between these scales and of course around the face. This stage can be quite messy and will no doubt require tidying up the surrounding scales afterwards. So for this glow I started off nice and bright using Temple Guard Blue. It's really important to thin this down, especially when working between the scales, as this will help with the capillary action. To further brighten this glow, I used a mix between Gauss Blaster Green and Baharoth Blue. Baharoth will work perfectly fine on its own for this, but I wanted a subtle green tinge to the highlight. I'm focusing this stage on the areas that I imagine the light or energy to be the strongest, as if it's coming from within the body of the Saurus, so where segments of scales intersect and more towards the head area, as well as within the mouth and eyes. Once that was done, I wanted to add some subtle shading around the scales and anywhere where the energy effect was fading out. So for this I made a mix between Sotek Green and Cantor Blue and then carefully shaded around these areas. Now the glow effect was starting to look pretty good. I did still need to take up the brightness a bit further in a few hotspots, however I decided to block in the scales again with a Cantor and black base coat to see how it was all looking. You can either paint these back in at this point or wait until the final highlights are placed. For the final details on the glow, I simply added white into the previous mix and then used this to pick out any hot spots, so inside of the mouth, the eyes, etc. You can pretty much go all the way up to pure white for this, but I saved this for the tiniest little spot highlights. Now once I was happy with the glow, it was time to paint in the rest of the scales. First of all for this I used the fang, which worked great for the sections on the legs where they were blending into the surrounding skin. However, when it came to the scales on the back where they were much darker, this first stage required darkening with some of the Cantor and black mix. And looking back now, I think this is where mine slightly differs from the box art. Just looking at the images now, I'm almost certain there's some kind of purple in there, but it's very difficult to tell. So if you are trying to match that more precisely, I would probably add a touch of Naggaroth Night or even Naggaroth and Black into the fang for this first stage. I must say these scales felt like they took the longest part of the miniature, and although they actually didn't really take that long and were in fact quite straightforward, just applying several stages of highlights, trying to keep them nice and sharp, and in the end the finished look was amazing. But going through all these stages really did feel like a bit of a slog to begin with. I would say for an army, especially for this first stage, you don't have to be as precise as I am here. I'm simply doing this to show the process for painting the box art miniatures, and the original had been done so well that I thought it was really worth spending the time to try to match it. For the next stage highlight on the scales, I used Rust Grey, again painting this around all of the edges and within the previous stage. Now I've sped up the footage by about 6 times here. You can see it took a little while to get all of these highlighted, especially when it came to these smaller scales. I found it much easier to approach these scales in sections, so treating one side of the spine as a section, and then the tail and head as different sections. Breaking it down like this helps to keep me focused, and you get all those small wins where you start to see everything come together. Now for the final highlight, I used Fenrisian Grey, this time mostly just focusing it on the upwards facing edges. Although this stage still needs to be quite precise, I found that this went a little quicker than the previous stage, as I didn't need to highlight around every single edge. Now another thing that will help speed up the process and make the edge highlighting a little bit easier is to make sure that you move the piece around to get the best angle when painting the edge. Obviously for me this is really difficult because I'm trying to keep the piece steady and in a very small area for the camera to see. But you don't have the same limits as me, and I highly recommend moving it around as much as necessary. Now finally, that was about it for the edge highlights on the scales. Something that I did notice on the box art was all the tiny dot highlights the painter had put onto the corners of the scales. There was something about this that almost felt like a constellation when looking at the finished piece, and I can only assume that this was intentionally done to accentuate the celestial look of the scheme. So I recreated this with precise dots of blue horror, picking out a few corners of the scales. And this was the end product. Now happy with the result on the scales, I continued this on for the head. This was quite tricky to both film and paint precisely, because there wasn't really anywhere to rest my hand, so for anyone confused as to why I wear gloves quite a lot, then this is quite a big benefit. With gloves on, I can rest my hand on the piece without too much worry that I'll rub off any highlights on the miniature. This benefit alone can save me a lot of work and time having to touch up areas later on. And I'm not going to bore you with going through the entire process again for the head, as it was pretty much exactly the same as the previous scales, but here's a few short snippets from that process. Now, all that was left to do was quickly revisit the chest area and add a few final highlights, and I did this just by mixing some white into the pallid witch flesh. A few highlights were then applied towards the top of the muscles, and also glazed a bit towards the middle of the belly and chest. And that's about it for this video. I'm pretty happy with the progress so far. Make sure to join me next time when I'll be painting the armor, the weapons, and all the other final details. Catch you in the next part.